Welcome, everyone. I am Dorie Clark, and I am here as part of Newsweek's weekly interview show, Better. I'm here with Robert Cialdini, who is the author of the seminal book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. Today, we are going to be talking about cultivating influence and how you can do it. Bob, so glad to have you here.
Well, I'm glad to be with you, Dorie. It's been a while, and I'm enjoying the opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much. And welcome to everyone who is here tuning in and joining us. Please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are, where you're dialing in from. And please feel free to add in your questions for Robert Cialdini because we will be taking them live. So the first question that I have for you, Bob, is your book, Influence, originally came out in 1984. It has sold, I see on the cover, 5 million copies, which is kind of extraordinary. You have just added 220 pages to this book. What, if you can give us a sense, what have you added to it? What more needs to be said about influence that you were tempted to go back in and add to your classic book?
Well, for one thing, the research has developed, evolved, and mushroomed in persuasion science in the 14 years since the last edition of the book. And it seemed to me there needed to be an update of just what we knew about how the influence process works and how to engage it. That's one thing. The second is what I just said about how to engage it. One of the things readers of the previous editions would say is, we understand these universal principles of influence that you've told us about. We would really appreciate it if you could give us the exact wording that we could use to harness the power of those procedures, those principles that you're saying are universal to getting effective influence outcomes. So there's a lot more of specifics of how you launch these principles, how you harness their influence so that it flows to you in the particular situation you're in. And then finally, the biggest change is that I've established a seventh universal principle of influence. I only had 6 in the previous ones, but it was very clear on the basis of the research that I saw and also what I was seeing around me that there's a 7th principle that I was missing. It's what we call unity, and it's the ability of a communicator to convince an audience that he or she is one of them, not just like them in preferences or styles or tastes or something, but has a common membership in a group that they use to define themselves, that they identify themselves with. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean and how powerful it can be. There was a study done on a college campus. Researchers took a college-aged young woman, had her stand in a very heavily trafficked portion of campus, and ask students passing by to contribute to this good cause. And she was getting some donations. But if she added one sentence, she more than doubled the contributions she got. And the sentence was, "I'm a student here too." In other words, I'm one of you. I'm of you. It's not just I'm similar to you as some kind in the category of student. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about categories that people use to identify themselves with. If you were asked, well, so who are you? What do you? Well, I'm a student at this school. Well, that if she says I'm there too, 250% more influence that you can measure in terms of contributions to a good cause. The good cause wasn't enough. The similarity of age of this young woman wasn't enough. She had to say, "I'm of you." And that changed everything.
That's so fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing that. We're here with Robert Cialdini. He is the author of the book Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. And we want to greet some of our terrific viewers who are joining us today. We have Michael from New Jersey, Kendra from Maryland, Marion from Atlanta, Carolyn from DC. We have Cheryl from St. Paul, Saroj from India, Stacy from St. Petersburg, Vicky from Texas, Anthony from England, Sue from Cincinnati, and many more. We're so glad to have you. Please feel free to type your questions for Robert Cialdini into the chat box. So, Bob, something that I'm curious about, you have been talking about unity, which is the seventh principle, the new principle of influence. This is a time, of course, where there's a lot of political divisions. There's a lot of talk about bringing people together. I can imagine that the principle of unity is something that might be a bit of a double-edged sword, that for people who are interested in diversity, who are interested in being inclusive of differences, we might tend to worry, how might the unity principle be used or misused? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the one that is regrettable right now is on the political front. We're seeing that parties and the memberships inside those parties are more committed to loyalty inside the group than they are to some sort of mutually positive direction forward. There was a study that showed that if you people who are members of one or another political party, it works for both the same way, are told that a politician of their party has evidence that he or she was committing a campaign violation, campaign funding violation, under what circumstance, to what extent would you try to suppress it rather than tell the truth about it? And the finding was, the more committed you were to the party, the more likely you were to choose loyalty to the party against truth, right? Against honesty. And when the researchers investigated why that was the case, there was a regrettable reason. It was that people felt that if somebody associated with them was found to be criminal, it would affect their reputations. So they were doing it out of self-interest. The sense of being bonded with the other members of a group caused them to be willing to be dishonest and even suppress evidence, because they didn't want to be associated with someone who had that kind of reputation. It would flow to them. So that's the negative side of it. The positive side is when we can arrange for people to see us as one of them, right? They become much more willing to be cooperative, to be trustful of us, to be, and if we can point to those things, then we become more influential as a result, more effective in moving people in directions that we think are best for them.
I think that's such an interesting point. Thank you for raising that, Bob. And Kendra asks a related question that I think is one that might be on a lot of people's minds, that ties in about, honestly, how we can try to leverage ourselves to become better people. She wants to know, how do we help ourselves, or others for that matter, remain open to hearing from those who are not like us? If it's clear that the unity principle is just not necessarily in play, if people really are different from us, how can we avoid in ourselves the knee-jerk reaction of othering the other person?
Right, of othering. Yeah, and it is to search for, identify, and then raise to the surface commonalities with these individuals that we didn't know existed. There was a lovely study of negotiators who were bargaining with one another over email. Right? They weren't allowed in the same room because of COVID and all these kinds of things. They were bargaining over email, which is the most bloodless of all communication channels we have ever developed. There's no humanity there. There's just some cipher on the other end of cyberspace somewhere, and you're negotiating with this person. And they found that under those circumstances, the negotiators were stymied. They had deadlocked negotiations 30% of the time. They walked away with nothing. Each side said sorry, and they walked away. No agreement, nothing. Half of them, however, were first asked to send some information about one another across before they began the negotiation, right? What are your interests? What are your hobbies? Where did you grow up? What was your major in school? These kinds of things, right? And they found that act of exchanging information reduced stymied negotiations from 30% to 6%. Now, the researchers who were thrilled at this had first explained it in terms of, well, you're humanizing the other person. By giving a lot of information about that other individual you didn't know, you made that person seem more like a person instead of just somebody else, clicking keys somewhere. But that's not what they found when they looked deep into the data. It wasn't the amount of information they knew about the other individual. It was whether that information revealed commonalities that they didn't recognize. You're a runner? I'm a runner. Oh, you have teenagers? I have teenagers. You're an only child? I'm an only child. Those were the kinds of things that created room for giving grace to one another who started out as adversaries, right? Now they came together and were much more likely to produce mutually beneficial outcomes.
That is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And in fact, you've given me an opportunity for another plug off my shelf, because I am, in fact, a Robert Cialdini true believer. So this study gets talked about in one of your other fine books. Yes, 50 scientifically proven ways to be persuasive, which is another wonderful book in addition to your newest one, Influence, the updated edition. So we love that. Thank you so much. And a question came in from someone who wants to see you and raise you above and beyond commonalities. Our friend Harsha in London is curious. He says, "Dear Dr. Cialdini, big fan of your work. Always mention it on my podcast. Above and beyond commonalities, do you have other suggestions for building rapport when meeting someone for the first time?" What are your thoughts on that, Bob?
Interesting question, because it aligns with a question one of my colleagues raised. His son had just turned 13, so he's a teenager. And he was going around, my colleague, and asking people whose judgment he trusts, what is the best advice I could give my son? His name was Liam. As he begins being an adult, what would steer him best from your standpoint of how could he be more influential and reduce the barriers between him and other people who he didn't know? And so here's the advice I gave him. Advise him when he goes into a situation with people he doesn't know, he's not familiar with, right? Advise him to expect the best from those people and of those people, because that will allow him to be generous with them. Expecting them, the best from them and of them, the kind of people they are, will allow him to be generous. And that generosity has 3 downstream consequences that align with the 6 principles of influence, one each. The first is, if you're generous with people, they like you more, right? Secondly, if you're generous with people, by the principle of reciprocation, which in all human society says we want to give back to others what they first give to us, those people will now be generous with you. And finally, once they perceive themselves being generous with you, giving you resources, trusting you with these resources, and being cooperative as a consequence, right? They will have made a commitment to you and your outcomes, and they will want to be consistent with that positive view of you and their intentions to do well for you into the future. So you've got liking, you've got reciprocation, and you've got commitment and consistency, all working from that generosity that you begin with. But you have to create the generosity by making a mindset shift. Go into every situation where you don't know anybody initially, expecting the best of them.
It's powerful advice. Thank you very much. This is Dorie Clark. I am here with Newsweek for our weekly interview show, Better. We're here with Robert Cialdini. He is the author of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. If you would like to learn more about his work and get his book, go to his website, influenceatwork.com. And if you'd like to make sure you never miss one of our weekly episodes, you can go to dorieclark.com and download a free self-assessment and join my email list so you can get regular updates about our fantastic guests. If you're enjoying this conversation, hit the like button, hit the share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it as well. And to the point that you just raised, Bob, about reciprocity, Darcy actually was curious. She said, I'm wondering whether you think the strategy of reciprocity has shifted in recent years. She says, I'm not certain people anymore feel the same natural reciprocal obligation as in the past because it's just been used and overused so much. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you feel like people are a little bit perhaps burned out on the reciprocity aspect, or is this just so ingrained in human nature that it's going to be forever?
No, I think Darcy's right that we've had a set of experiences where people have tried to exploit it by beginning by giving us something we didn't even ask for or didn't even want, but feel trapped by the rule of reciprocation that says, okay, now I owe this person something, right? That is worrisome. But I would not advise blanket rejection of this sort of thing. A lot of people do want to begin an interaction or do want to be helpful, give us benefits, advantages, new information that we didn't have, and so on, in an honest way. We don't want to block ourselves away from them. It seems to me the key is to go ahead and accept those positive features, but not to react as a sucker, right? When we see that it was a trick or a device, some sort of artifice designed to get us to do that sort of thing. Then the rule for reciprocity says we have to give gifts or services or favors to people who give us gifts, favors, or services. It does not say we have to give gifts, favors, and services to people who give us tricks, who trick us. The rule doesn't say that at all. So we should accept, but then verify, accept and verify whether that was really something or whether it was designed to trap us into a positive response. And at that point, feel welcome to walk away without a tug from the rule of reciprocity that says, no, we're not obligated to give back to people who try to trick us. Not at all.
That's a really important distinction. Thank you for that. And we all, over the past 14, 15 months, have had a pretty unique experience living through COVID and having everything shifted to the virtual world. So much of our experience now mediated through Zoom and video calls. And so Philippe had a question that I think a lot of people might be wondering about, which is, are influence principles different in the digital space versus the real world? What are your thoughts, especially coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a question I've been concerned with. And actually, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because when the last edition, there wasn't really a viable digital space for commerce. There now is a flourishing such space for commerce. And there was a study done that looked at the question. It was what they did was to look at 6,700 e-commerce platforms for A/B tests to see which features they could turn on or off in A/B tests, and had the biggest impact on conversions from prospect to customer. And what they found was there were 29 different features or factors that they looked at in these A/B tests within them. And some of them were economic factors, like, is there free shipping? Some of them were technological factors. Is there a search function? Some of them were persuasive functions. Was there a call to action line at the end of the appeal? These kinds of things. All right. The top 6 were the 6 universal principles of influence. The platforms can change, but the ways in which we are built, the things that are part of the human condition, don't change in 14 years, since there has and has not been a digital space. No, we're still the same people. We still respond positively to the things that have in the past been good shortcuts for us to use to move us in proper directions. Now, with that said, I'm going to seem to say something opposite, but it's not really opposite. Although the power of these principles remain on digital platforms, just as they do in face-to-face or mail or phone platforms, right? One of the principles has become much more accessible to us to employ in deciding whether to say yes or no. And that's the principle of social proof, that says one way that we can reduce our uncertainty about whether we should step forward and make ourselves available to a product or service, or we should partner with somebody, or we should vote for somebody, whatever the request is, right? One of the ways we can reduce that uncertainty is to look at what our peers are doing. What are the people around us like us doing in this space, right? And we now have, because of the internet, access to throngs of individuals that we would never have had access to in terms of their opinions, their experiences, their ratings of the things we see on the internet that are available there, right? We now have access to people all over the world who we can check in on and see how they experienced this idea or proposal or recommendation or product or service. That has made that principle of social proof come to the surface in terms of how frequently we can access it. I saw an article that said that people who consistently purchase and shop online, 98% of them first check product reviews before they buy. 98%? Dorie, we can't get 98% of the people in the world to believe that the earth is round. But we get 98% piling into this particular way to decide whether or not to be influenced, right? So, social proof That's the one that's gotten the most traction since online platforms have become available to us.
It's a really helpful distinction. Thank you very much for that, Bob. Again, we are here with Robert Cialdini. He's the author of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, with the new edition. If you want to learn more about Bob and his work and get his book, you can go to influenceatwork.com. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our weekly episodes, go to DorieClark.com/LinkedIn. You can follow me there and get all of our updates. So we had a great question come in, Bob, which I'm curious about. I think probably a lot of folks are. It's about how can we leverage influence to influence ourselves? Irina wants to know, could you please share one or two ideas on how somebody could influence him or herself to keep working toward their goals when they might be a little frustrated? They might not see a solution or progress. Is there a way that we can apply this to sort of outsmart ourselves?
Yes, and there is. That's certainly the case. There's a lovely study that was done in Canada at Montreal, and it had to do with a team of people who were making calls from a university there, trying to get alumni to contribute to the university's general fund, and they were given a piece of paper that had the tips on it that they should be sure to hit when they engaged on a phone call one of these alumni. And half of them, the piece of paper was blank except for the tips. The other half had a picture of a runner winning a race behind the tips. Those people, right, collected 60% more funds because what was prominent in consciousness while they were doing this was an image of high performance, of achievement, of success. And that drove them to be more successful in their exchanges with the people on the phone. Now, we can do that, right? Now, here's the key, though, for ourselves. Put a picture of a runner winning a race on your screen as you're doing something that requires a lot of drive and energy and a focus on success. Now, here's the best part of it. These researchers did a follow-on study where they looked at where success didn't mean energy and activity and drive, but meant the opposite, stepping back and being contemplative and thoughtful, pensive, thinking hard about a problem. They gave people difficult problems to solve, business problems to solve within a certain amount of time. And half of them had a picture of Rodin's The Thinker on it, where thinking was now high in consciousness as a result. When they look at the number of items that were solved, number of problems that were solved, those who got the picture of the runner winning the race, that didn't increase their solutions at all compared to a control group that didn't get any image at all. But those who got the thinker solved 48% more problems. Okay, we can do this. We can do this to ourselves. We can structure our environments in such a way that we will be consistent with a particular kind of image or value that has been raised to our consciousness, right? And produces better outcomes for us as a result.
So great. I love that. Robert Cialdini, we have time for perhaps just one more quick question, but this is an important and timely one. It's one that I know from news articles that you have weighed in on before, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Dr. D.T. Ogilvy has written in and wants to know, if you were advising President Biden on how to address vaccine hesitancy using your principles of influence that you talk about, what would you advise on this pressing public health issue?
Interestingly enough, I would use unity. That is, there's research to show that there's a very powerful kind of communicator that if we give airtime to, changes people who are hesitant or resistant of moving in a particular direction. It's called the convert communicator. This is somebody who used to believe, right, what the hesitant people currently believe, but got a new piece of information or an experience that changed their mind. So you're giving these folks a communicator who is of them. They can't dismiss this person as saying, "Oh, that's not me. That's somebody else. This is somebody who believed exactly what you believed, and then had an experience." Let's say, my mother wouldn't wear a mask, wouldn't get vaccinated, and she got the COVID and she passed this week. So some kind of message like that, very powerful, because it's coming from someone who is of you.
Such a powerful point, and very important in today's context that is often so polarized. We have been talking with Robert Cialdini. He's the author of the new edition of his seminal book, Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. You can learn more about Bob and his work and get your copy at influenceatwork.com. This is Dorie Clark on behalf of Newsweek. We are so pleased, Robert Cialdini, to have you here, and thank you all for tuning in.
I enjoyed it.
See you next week, everyone.